The farmer who lost a sheep to a wolf in the night and who woke in the morning to find the tracks in the snow was living the Norse relationship with wolves, not in the elevated register of mythology and shamanic transformation, but in the immediate, visceral register of economic vulnerability and physical danger. And his response to this experience was shaped not just by the practical need to protect his livestock, but by the entire cultural framework that told him what wolves meant, what their presence in his world signified, what his relationship to them should be. He might set traps, as any sensible farmer would, but he might also, if the folk traditions of his community preserved some memory of the old sacred associations, feel something beyond simple anger or fear in his response to the wolf's predation, some trace of the old ambivalence, the old respect, the old recognition that the wolf was a sacred creature who existed in a different relationship to the fundamental powers of the world than he did, and that its hunger, however inconvenient and destructive from his perspective, was an expression of forces that exceeded any individual human claim to be the center of the world's concern. The children who grew up in Norse households, hearing the stories of Fenrir and Skuld and Hati and Jerry and Freki and Huginn and Muninn, who learned the wolf and raven kennings in the poetry that was recited at communal gatherings, who were given names containing the elements for wolf and raven, and who wore amulets bearing these animals' images, were being formed by these encounters into a particular kind of human being, a kind of human being shaped by a particular understanding of what the world was and what their place in it was. They were being formed into people who understood from earliest childhood that the world was vast and dangerous and spiritually charged, that the animals they shared their landscape with were not merely resources or threats, but were participants in a cosmic drama that encompassed both the human and the divine, and that the qualities of the wolf and the raven, the ferocity and the intelligence, the hunger and the perception, the loyalty and the wildness, were qualities that a fully realized human being needed to cultivate in themselves and to honor in the world around them. This formation was not a formal education in any institutional sense, but was a cultural transmission, a slow and continuous process of immersion in a shared world of stories and images and practices and encounters that gradually shaped the sensibility and the understanding of every person who grew up within it. The loss of this formation, the dissolution of the cultural framework that transmitted the sacred associations of wolves and ravens from generation to generation, and that embedded the Norse relationship with these animals in the deepest structures of thought and feeling, is perhaps the most significant consequence of the Christianization of Scandinavia, more significant in some ways than the loss of any specific ritual practice or theological belief. What was lost was not merely a set of beliefs about wolves and ravens, but a way of being in the world, a habitual orientation toward the non-human that understood it as sacred and attended to it with the same quality of serious, respectful engagement that it gave to the human and the divine. The recovery of this orientation, or rather the development of a new orientation that is adequate to the ecological and spiritual challenges of the modern world, is one of the most urgent tasks facing contemporary culture and the Norse tradition, with its extraordinary depth and sophistication in the domain of human-animal spiritual relationships, has much to offer those who are willing to engage with it seriously and honestly, without the distortions of romantic idealization or ideological appropriation that have too often characterized the modern reception of Viking culture. The wolves that are slowly, tentatively returning to the Scandinavian landscape after decades of absence are not the mythological wolves of the Norse tradition. They are real animals, biological creatures with their own lives and their own concerns that have nothing to do with human mythology or human spirituality, and they deserve to be understood and protected on their own terms rather than as symbols of human spiritual aspiration. But they are also inescapably the same animals that the Norse honored as sacred, the same species whose intelligence and social complexity and predatory grace inspired one of the most profound and most enduring explorations of the human-animal spiritual relationship that any civilization has ever produced. To see a wolf in the modern Scandinavian landscape is to encounter an animal that carries, in the accumulated cultural memory of the people who share that landscape, a weight of significance that goes far beyond its biological reality, a weight that is the product of centuries of intimate human engagement with the lupine nature. And that speaks, to those who know how to hear it, of a time when the boundary between the human world and the world of sacred animals was more permeable and more honestly acknowledged than it is today. A time when the howl of a wolf in the winter night was understood not merely as the sound of a hungry predator, but as a message from the forces that made the world, and that will, in the end, reclaim it. The ravens that circle above the Norwegian mountains and the Icelandic lava fields today are the same species, and in some meaningful sense, the same kind of presence that once perched on the shoulders of Odin in the stories that gave meaning to Viking life. Their intelligence has not diminished. Their social complexity has not been simplified. Their black eyes are still capable of the same quality of watchful, evaluating attention that the Norse recognized as something more than ordinary animal awareness. And if we are willing to look at them with the same quality of attention that the Norse brought to their observation of ravens, if we are willing to see in their behavior not merely a set of biological mechanisms, but an expression of a kind of intelligence that is genuinely different from ours, but no less real and no less worthy of respect, then we may find in that act of attentive regard something of the spiritual orientation that the Norse brought to their relationship with these extraordinary birds, an orientation that understood the raven not as a symbol of death or a harbinger of misfortune, but as a teacher, a companion, a mirror of possibilities that the purely human imagination is too limited to conceive on its own. The terrifying spiritual truth that the Vikings kept close by honoring wolves and ravens as sacred companions was, finally, The truth that the universe is not made for human beings, that the world does not revolve around human concerns or defer to human wishes, that the forces which sustain life and which destroy it are indifferent to the distinctions that human beings draw between themselves and the rest of creation, and that the only adequate response to this truth is not denial or despair, but a fierce, clear-eyed, courageous engagement with reality as it actually is, an engagement sustained by the qualities that the wolf and the raven embody, by strength and endurance and loyalty and ferocity and intelligence and perception and the willingness to see clearly even when what one sees is terrifying. This is what the Vikings knew, and this is what their sacred animals taught them, and this is why the wolf and the raven still matter, still speak, still call to something deep in the human soul across the 1,000 years and more that separate us from the world that produced them, a world that was in many ways harsher and more dangerous than our own, but that possessed, in its relationship with its sacred animals, a quality of spiritual honesty and ecological wisdom that our own world has largely lost and that it desperately needs to find again. The howl of the wolf in the winter darkness and the call of the raven in the morning light are not merely sounds. They are reminders, as they have always been, of the truth of the world and the question that they ask of us, as they asked of the Vikings who first learned to hear them as sacred, is whether we are brave enough and wise enough to listen. This is where the story of the Vikings and their sacred wolves and ravens ultimately leads us, not to a museum of dead beliefs or a catalogue of extinct practices, but to a living question about the nature of our relationship with the non-human world and about the spiritual resources we bring to that relationship. The Norse tradition, at its deepest and most honest, was not a tradition of domination or exploitation, but of engagement, of the willingness to take the non-human seriously, to honor its power and its intelligence and its spiritual significance, to allow it to teach us what we cannot learn from human sources alone. The wolf and the raven were the primary teachers in this tradition, and their lessons, encoded in the myths and the art and the poetry and the ritual practice of the Viking world, are lessons that remain as relevant and as urgent today as they were when the first Norse skald composed the first kenning about the raven's harvest, and the first Norse warrior put on a wolf skin and felt the wild nature rising in his blood. The transmission of the Norse sacred animal tradition into the modern world did not occur through any single channel or any single moment of cultural recovery, but through a vast and complex network of influences and mediations that spans the entire period from the Viking Age to the present day. A network that includes the Icelandic literary tradition, the romantic rediscovery of Norse mythology, the development of academic Norse studies as a scholarly discipline, the popular culture representations of the Viking world that have proliferated in recent decades, and the living folk traditions of Scandinavia that have maintained in various attenuated and transformed forms something of the old orientation toward the natural world that gave the wolf and the raven, their sacred status in the first place. To trace this network in its full complexity would require a separate study of enormous length, but it is worth pausing as we approach the conclusion of this long exploration of the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens to consider some of the most significant nodes in this network. The points at which the transmission of the old tradition has been most concentrated and most consequential, because understanding these nodes helps us to understand not just how the tradition has survived, but why it has survived. What it is about the Norse sacred animal tradition that has given it the resilience and the continuing relevance that has allowed it to persist across so many centuries of cultural transformation. The single most important node in the network of transmission is, without question, the Icelandic literary tradition of the 12th through 14th centuries, the period in which the great mythological and saga texts were committed to writing by Icelandic scholars and authors who understood themselves to be preserving a cultural heritage that was in danger of being lost as the generations with direct memories of the pagan tradition passed from the same. The motivations of these authors were complex and not entirely consistent with one another, encompassing genuine scholarly interest in the old traditions, national pride in the distinctively Icelandic cultural heritage, aesthetic appreciation for the literary qualities of the old stories and poems, and, in some cases, a degree of genuine sympathy for the spiritual framework that the old mythology expressed even among people who were formally committed to the Christian faith. Whatever the specific motivations of individual authors, the collective result of the Icelandic literary project was the preservation of a body of textual evidence about Norse mythology and belief that is without parallel in any other Germanic tradition, a preservation that was made possible by the particular combination of geographical isolation, legal culture, and literary sophistication that characterized medieval Iceland, and that created the conditions in which the old traditions could be written down and transmitted to future generations. Snorri Sturluson, whose prose Edda remains the single most comprehensive and most systematically organized account of Norse mythology that has survived from the medieval period, was the central figure in this preservation effort, and his treatment of wolves and ravens in the prose Edda has been the primary source through which later generations have understood the Norse sacred animal tradition. Snorri's approach to his mythological material was shaped by his dual identity as a Christian scholar and a deeply engaged student of the old Norse poetic and narrative tradition, and the tension between these two identities is visible throughout the prose Edda in the way that he simultaneously preserves the old mythological material with remarkable fidelity and frames it within an interpretive apparatus that seeks to make it comprehensible and acceptable to a Christian audience. His treatment of Odin's wolves and ravens illustrates this dual approach clearly, as he provides detailed and apparently accurate information about the names and roles of these animals, while also, in various places, suggesting euhemeristic interpretations that rationalize the mythology by presenting the gods as historical human beings who were later deified by their followers, an interpretive strategy that allowed the preservation of mythological content without the theological scandal of presenting pagan gods as genuine divine beings. The poetic Edda, which was compiled in the Codex Regius manuscript in approximately 1270 CE, though the poems it contains are considerably older, complements the prose Edda with a body of mythological and heroic poetry that provides the emotional and imaginative texture of the Norse sacred animal tradition in a way that Snorri's systematic prose account cannot fully capture. The poems of the poetic Edda do not explain or rationalize the mythological material, but present it directly in the compressed and imagistically rich form of Old Norse verse. And the experience of reading these poems, even in translation, has a quality of immediate engagement with the Norse spiritual world that the prose accounts lack. The raven imagery in poems like Grimnismal and Völuspá, and the wolf imagery in Völuspá and Lokasenna, carry a charge of genuine spiritual intensity that speaks directly to the imagination, and that has been experienced by readers across many centuries and many cultural contexts as something more than merely literary, as an encounter with a way of understanding the world that remains alive and relevant even in conditions utterly different from those in which it was first developed. The rediscovery of the Eddic texts by European scholars in the 17th and 18th centuries marked the beginning of a new phase in the transmission of the Norse sacred animal tradition, a phase characterized by the engagement of a broader European intellectual culture with the mythological material that the Icelandic tradition had preserved. The Danish scholar Ole Worm and the Swedish antiquarian Olaus Rudbeck were among the first to draw serious scholarly attention to the Norse mythological texts in the 17th century, and their work initiated a tradition of Norse scholarship that would flower in the 18th century with the translations and commentaries of scholars like Paul-Henri Mallet, whose work on Norse mythology was read by educated Europeans across the continent, and that introduced figures like Odin and his wolves and ravens to audiences who had previously known nothing of the Norse tradition. Mallet's work was translated into English by Bishop Thomas Percy in 1770 as Northern Antiquities, and in this form it became one of the primary conduits through which Norse mythology entered the English literary imagination, influencing writers and poets from William Blake to Thomas Gray to the young Thomas Percy himself, whose collection of medieval English and Scottish ballads, the relics of ancient English poetry, was shaped in part by his engagement with the Norse material and contributed to the broader romantic rediscovery of the medieval and the primitive that would make Norse mythology one of the defining cultural enthusiasms of the 19th century. The romantic engagement with Norse mythology, which reached its fullest and most influential expression in the work of Richard Wagner, but which also produced significant results in the literature, art, and music of Britain, Scandinavia, and Germany throughout the 19th century, transformed the cultural status of the Norse sacred animal tradition in ways that were both enabling and distorting, preserving the emotional power of the old associations while simultaneously aestheticizing them in ways that sometimes obscured their genuine spiritual depth and philosophical seriousness. The wolves and ravens of romantic Norse mythology were, in many of their appearances, more theatrical than the wolves and ravens of the genuine Norse tradition, more obviously symbolic, more clearly designed to produce specific emotional effects in an audience that was encountering them as literary or musical experiences, rather than as elements of a living spiritual practice. This aestheticization was in some ways inevitable, given the distance that separated the romantic artists and their audiences from the world in which the Norse tradition had been a living reality, but it also represented a kind of impoverishment, a reduction of the full complexity and the genuine philosophical depth of the old tradition to a set of evocative images and dramatic situations. Wagner's treatment of the wolves and ravens of Norse mythology in the Ring cycle illustrates both the power and the limitations of the romantic approach to the sacred animal tradition. His Wotan, the Germanic Odin, is accompanied by his two ravens, Huginn and Muninn, throughout the cycle, and their role as divine messengers and observers of the human world is preserved with considerable fidelity to the mythological sources, giving the ravens a genuine, dramatic function in the narrative rather than merely a decorative one. The wolves of the Norse tradition appear in Wagner's work primarily through the Volsung dynasty. The family of heroes who descend from Wotan and who are explicitly associated with wolf imagery in both their names and their behavior, with Sigmund and Siglinde and their son Siegfried, all carrying traces of the lupine nature that the Norse tradition attributed to the descendants of Odin. But Wagner's mythological wolves are ultimately more romantic than Norse, more concerned with the expression of individual passion and heroic will than with the philosophical implications of the wolf as a representative of the forces of chaos and destruction that the Norse tradition explored so honestly and so deeply. The tragic dimensions of the wolf in Norse mythology, its role as the destroyer of the divine order, its representation of the forces that could not be permanently contained and that would ultimately consume even the greatest of the gods, are present in Wagner's work, but are subordinated to the more immediate romantic concerns with love and death and the heroic individual's struggle against an unjust world. The development of academic Norse studies as a scholarly discipline in the 19th and 20th centuries provided a corrective to the romantic aestheticization of the Norse tradition, restoring the genuine complexity and the philosophical depth of the mythological material through careful philological and historical analysis of the primary sources. Scholars like Jacob Grimm, whose Deutsche Mythology of 1835 provided the first comprehensive scholarly treatment of Germanic mythology, including its Norse components, and Sophus Buger, whose controversial theories about the origins of Norse mythology sparked important debates about the independence and the antiquity of the Norse tradition. and later scholars like Jean de Vries, Georges Dumézil, and Hilda Ellis Davidson, whose work on the comparative mythology and the shamanic dimensions of Norse religion opened up entirely new perspectives on the tradition, all contributed to a growing scholarly understanding of the Norse sacred animal tradition that went far beyond a romantic aestheticization, and that engaged seriously with the genuine theological and philosophical content of the mythology. This scholarly tradition has continued to develop throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, producing an extraordinary body of work on every aspect of the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens. From the philological analysis of individual mythological texts to the archaeological study of animal imagery in Viking Age material culture, to the comparative anthropological analysis of Norse shamanism and its relationship to other shamanic traditions around the world. The work of scholars like Neil Price, whose comprehensive study of Viking Age shamanism, The Viking Way, published in 2002 and substantially revised and expanded in 2019, has done more than any other single work to illuminate the genuine depth and sophistication of the Norse spiritual tradition and its relationship with the animal world, represents the highest achievement of the modern academic engagement with the Norse sacred animal tradition, bringing together archaeological evidence, textual analysis, comparative anthropology, and cognitive science in a synthesis that reveals the full complexity of the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens, without reducing it either to the romantic aestheticism of the 19th century or to the dry antiquarianism that has sometimes characterized academic Norse studies at its least. Inspired, Price's work and the broader tradition of scholarship it represents has made it possible for the first time in the modern era to engage with the Norse sacred animal tradition with something approaching the seriousness and the depth that it deserves to understand the wolf and the raven, not merely as interesting mythological figures or evocative symbols, but as central components of a sophisticated and coherent spiritual worldview that has genuine philosophical relevance to the questions that confront contemporary human civilization. The popular culture representations of the Viking world that have proliferated in the early 21st century, from the television series Vikings and The Last Kingdom to the Marvel Cinematic Universe's treatment of Norse mythology in the Thor films and the video game God of War series, have introduced the Norse sacred animal tradition to a global audience of hundreds of millions of people who have no ancestral connection to Scandinavian culture and no prior knowledge of the Eddic texts or the Viking Age historical record. The wolves and ravens of these popular culture representations are inevitably simplified and aestheticized versions of their mythological originals, shaped by the demands of entertainment and the conventions of the genres in which they appear, but they nevertheless carry something of the original sacred associations, something of the old emotional charge that made these animals important to the Norse in the first place.